The alley was narrow and silent as Leon moved forward. Each step measured, each breath slow and deliberate, the rain falling in thin sheets that turned the ground into a mirror of dark glass. The air was heavy with the smell of wet brick and something faintly metallic, something he had smelled too many times in places where danger was always close. He had been here before. Not this alley, not this city, but this exact feeling, this exact weight, pressing into the back of his neck like unseen eyes, watching every movement, the kind of feeling that never lies. He shifted his grip on the rifle, the familiar texture of the worn grip in his palm, the only thing steady in a world that felt ready to explode at any second. He glanced left and right, the shadows clinging to the walls, refusing to give up their secrets. The light above flickering weakly, as if afraid to shine too bright. In this place, he knew better than to trust quiet. He knew quiet was only the inhale before the storm. He could feel the rain soaking into his jacket, the fabric clinging to his arms, the cold seeping into his skin. But his mind was burning sharp, scanning the depth of the alley, the outlines of doors, the faint shape of a dumpster pushed against the far wall, every detail locked into memory. He took another step and another, his boots sending small splashes into the puddles below, the sound echoing faintly between the tall buildings like whispers, repeating in a language only the streets understood. Somewhere ahead, something shifted. It was not loud, but it was there. A scrape like a shoe dragging, or maybe the slide of metal against concrete. He stopped without thinking, his body freezing into place, his breathing, shallow eyes narrowing into the darkness. The rain seemed to slow the entire world, shrinking into this one moment. The sound did not come again, but he could feel it. The certainty that someone was there, someone waiting. He tightened his hold on the rifle, his muscles tensing, ready to act, if the moment demanded it. Then it happened, fast, too fast for the mind to catch before the body reacted. A shadow peeled away from the wall in front of him, a blur of motion, moving low and fast, hands reaching out. Not for him, but for the weapon. The rifle was torn from his grip, so clean, so precise, that for half a second it felt like a dream. But then the weight was gone, and the sound of boots slamming against wet concrete filled the space in front of him. His heart kicked once hard, and the training took over his hands already, up his stance, shifting to meet the threat. But there was no time to aim, no time to think, only the dark shape retreating a few steps. Rifle now in their hands, Leon did not move toward them. Not yet. His eyes were darting to the sides, because he knew this was never just one person. This was a lure, a distraction. The real danger was always in the corners. In the blind spots, he caught movement to his left, a figure leaning out just enough for the pale light to catch the edge of a weapon, the glint unmistakable. The rain sliding over the steel like oil, his pulse hammered in his ears, the sound almost louder than the storm. The shadow in front of him stepped back, rifle steady and aimed now, and Leon could feel the aim like a physical touch, the kind that makes your skin crawl. He shifted slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to make the shooter adjust the barrel a fraction. The first step in a dance that would last seconds, but decide everything. The rain kept falling, pooling between them like a thin silver river that neither wanted to cross first. Somewhere above a window slammed shut, the sound startling in the stillness, and Leon used the fraction of distraction to scan the rooftops, the walls, the reflections in the puddles. Anything that could give him the edge. He knew how fights like this ended. If you let them drag on too long, the one who hesitated never walked away. He could taste the metal in the air, stronger now, thicker. The alley was a trap, but he was still alive, and as long as he was alive, he had a chance. The rain rolled down his face, cold and sharp, his hands flexing slightly, ready to move, his legs bent in the smallest crouch, preparing for the explosion that would come because it would come. There was no way out of this without it. The shadows seemed to lean closer, watching, hungry for what would happen next, the air heavy enough to choke, and yet Leon's mind was clearer than glass. The rifle was gone, but the fight was far from over. 5 armed men emerged from the corners, as if the alley itself had given birth to them. Their movements in perfect rhythm, their boots hitting the wet ground with the same cold certainty that soldiers have when they know they have the upper hand. The rain streaked down their faces, dripping from the barrels of their weapons, each man positioned to cut off any path of escape, their eyes locked on Leon, with the kind of hunger that only comes when you believe the fight is already yours. The rifles and pistols aimed at his chest and head and legs, making him feel like the walls themselves had grown barrels and sights. He could hear the soft creak of leather, the faint click of a safety being released, the wet thud of a boot sinking into a puddle. The first man on the left was tall, broad shoulders with a scar cutting across his cheek that caught the dim light every time he shifted his stance. His weapon steady and unwavering, the man beside him, shorter, leaner eyes darting between Leon's face and his hands, as if measuring how fast he could move before Leon could react. The third man stood directly in front of Leon, the one who had taken the rifle, his grip tight, his stance perfect, not a hint of fear in the way he held the weapon as though it had always belonged to him to his right. Another figure emerged with slow, deliberate steps, his hood pulled low but his grin visible even in the half-light. The last man stayed furthest back, his weapon aimed, but his head tilted, slightly watching the scene like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Leon's mind was already counting distances, angles, the space between each man and the slickness of the ground beneath them. His breathing controlled his eyes, never staying on one face for too long, scanning for any twitch, any movement that would break the stillness. The rain kept falling, each drop loud in the silence, the kind of silence that builds until it feels like it will break your skull from the inside. The air between them felt electric heavy with the knowledge that one wrong move would end it all. The man with Leon's rifle took a step forward, his boots splashing through a shallow puddle, his voice low but sharp as he said something Leon could not make out over the rain. The tone alone was enough to make the meaning clear. Surrender, give up. Let it end here. But Leon did not move, his stance unchanged, his hands still slightly open. Not in surrender, but in readiness. The man's eyes narrowed, perhaps reading that truth in Leon's posture. From somewhere behind them, the sound of metal clattering echoed briefly down the alley like a pipe falling or a door slamming. But none of the 5 looked away, their focus absolute. The water ran off, their jackets pooling around their boots, the steam of their breath visible in the cold air. Leon could smell the gun oil from here mixed with the wet scent of asphalt. It was a smell he knew too well, a smell that told him these men were not amateurs. One of them shifted his grip just slightly enough for the weapon to lower a fraction, and that was when Leon caught it. The brief moment when a man changes his weight from one leg to another, when balance is in flux, when reaction time slows by a fraction of a second. And fractions were enough for a man like Leon. But still he waited still. He held himself like stone, because he knew the first move would bring every barrel alive at once, and timing would be everything. The tall man on the left stepped, wider, closing the angle. The hooded man on the right mirrored the movement, the circle tightening like a snare trap in the underbrush. Leon had been caught in snares before, but he had also learned how to break them. The rain kept running down his face into his eyes, blurring the edges of his vision, but not the shapes that mattered. The men, the guns, the danger. Then the man with the rifle tilted his head slightly toward the others, and Leon could feel it. The shift, the silent order, the way their boots scraped against the wet ground as they prepared to move as one, the kind of movement that turned seconds into history. The alley had no wind, but Leon could feel the air change as if the space itself was taking a breath before it shattered into violence. And he knew in that moment that the next breath he took could be his last unless he turned the trap into a weapon. Leon stepped back, scanning for cover. But the walls around him were bare, wet brick, with no ledges, no crates, no broken doorways that could shield him. The ground slick with rain reflecting the dim streetlight in fractured pieces that shifted whenever. He moved. The sound of boots rushing closer filled his ears like the roll of distant thunder that was not distant at all. The kind that explodes right on top of you, the air so tight and heavy it felt like it would snap. The first man on the left shifted his weight forward, the barrel of his weapon rising the tall frame of his body, blocking what little light was spilling into the alley. Leon's eyes darted past him, searching for anything, even a loose pipe or a discarded bottle, but there was nothing. The place was stripped bare, like someone had cleared it for exactly this reason. The shorter man beside the giant moved too, knees bending the way trained men do before they lunge, every muscle coiled. The man with Leon's rifle gripped it tighter, the metal catching the flicker of light as if mocking him. The hooded man took another step in the puddle under his boot, breaking apart into ripples that spread toward Leon's feet, and in that ripple Leon felt the signal, the silent. Count the moment when their patience broke. Leon's right foot slid back just enough to find a shallow groove in the pavement, the smallest anchor for what he was about to do. His eyes locked on the shortest man who had started to lean forward, his weapon coming up. Leon's shoulders turned not away, but toward the danger closing the distance in a move that no one expected, because the alley had trained them to think of prey, retreating, not advancing. His left hand shot out, catching the wrist of the shorter man, twisting it inward until the weapon slipped free. The sound of bones straining, almost swallowed by the rain, the man's grunt sharp and guttural, before the weapon even hit the ground. Leon spun, using the man's body as a shield. The tall one hesitated just long enough, and in a fight like this, that hesitation was death. Leon shoved the shorter man into him, both of them stumbling back into the wall, the crack of bone against brick echoing like a gunshot. The hooded man lunged, from the right blade in hand, the edge glinting cold and fast. Leon's foot slid forward, kicking up water, his hand shooting out to meet the attack. The blade missed its mark, grazing the sleeve of his jacket. Leon's other hand clamped down on the man's forearm, yanking him forward into a brutal knee strike that folded him over the knife, clattering into the water. The sound sharp and final. Leon did not stop. His elbow came down on the back of the hooded man's neck, driving him into the ground where he stayed, unmoving. The man with the rifle raised it at last, his finger curling around the trigger. Leon's body was already moving before the shot could come, his hand darting for the fallen knife. He flicked it up from the puddle in one motion and threw it hard, the blade spinning through the wet air before sinking into the man's shoulder. The rifle dropped, clattering on the slick ground, the man's shout cutting through the alley, but there were still two left, and they were moving fast, one of them raising a pistol, the other reaching for Leon's arm. Leon pivoted low, letting the first shot pass over his head, the sound deafening in the close walls. His legs swept out, knocking the second man off his balance. His hands catching himself on the wet ground, but too slow to stop Leon's boot from coming down hard on his wrist, the weapon flying loose into the dark corner of the alley. Leon rose into the space between them, the rain pouring harder now, washing the blood from his hands before it could even stick his chest, rising and falling, but his eyes steady, cold, calculating. The fight was far from finished, and in the seconds that followed, he knew the alley would decide who walked away and who never moved again. One man lunged first, swinging the rifle toward his head, but Leon dipped low, letting the metal arc through the space his skull had occupied a heartbeat earlier, his body moving like it had done this 1,000 times in darker alleys and tighter rooms. His left hand shot up, catching the attacker's wrist, his grip like steel, the rain making their skin slick, but not enough to break free. Leon twisted hard, feeling the tendons pull and the bone strain. The man cried out, the sound raw and desperate, but it was swallowed by the storm. The rifle slipped sideways in the attacker's grip as Leon turned with it, dragging the man's arm in a violent circle, the elbow locking just enough to make the joint scream. The man's knees bent involuntarily. His stance collapsing, Leon shifted his weight a single step forward, and with a sharp thrust he drove his shoulder into the man's chest, the force slamming him against the wall, the impact echoing through the narrow alley, the man's head snapping. Back against brick before he slid down the wall, clutching his arm, his weapon clattering into the water at their feet. There was no pause, no time to catch breath. The hooded figure from the right was already rushing forward, the glint of metal in. His hand a blade longer than a kitchen knife. His steps fast, but deliberate, his eyes locked on Leon's throat. Leon shifted his stance, knees bent, weight forward, waiting for the exact moment the blade would come into range. The man's right arm, swung upward in a vicious arc, meant to end it with one stroke. But Leon stepped into the attack, not away. His left hand catching the wrist mid-swing, his right hand snapping up to grip the man's knuckles. The blade halted inches from his neck. With a brutal twist, Leon slammed the man's arm against the cold brick, the shock running up the man's arm, forcing his fingers open. The blade dropped into Leon's waiting hand. The switch was instant. His arm reversed the grip and drove the blade into the man's thigh, the scream that followed high and short. Leon's palm smashed against the man's jaw, sending him back stumbling until his body crashed into a stack of metal bins, the noise rattling through the rain. The others did not freeze. They came in together, two shadows moving with the speed of wolves, their weapons raised, one a pistol, the other a length of chain that swung through the air with a whistle. Leon's eyes tracked both the pistol, fired first, the muzzle flash lighting. The rain for a split second, Leon dropped to one knee. The shot tearing into the brick behind him, shards spraying across the ground. The chain came down next, slicing through the air toward his shoulder, but Leon rolled forward, the sound of the chain, hitting pavement like a steel whip snapping. He came up in a crouch under the pistol wielder's guard, his hand shooting up to grab the man's wrist before he could fire again. His other hand drove into the man's ribs once, twice, 3 times, the force folding him over. Leon tore the weapon free, turning it instantly on the man with the chain, the barrel level with his chest. Leon squeezed the trigger. The recoil sharp, but controlled the man, staggered back, the chain slipping from his grip, his body twisting as he fell into the water. The pistol now warm in Leon's hand, he stepped forward into the space between the last 2 men, their movements slowing. Now the confidence burned away by the reality that Leon was still standing still. Breathing, the rain fell harder, soaking them all, blurring the edges of their shapes. But Leon could see everything, every twitch, every shift of weight, every silent calculation they were making about whether to fight or run, and he knew that choice would be made in the next breath. His muscles coiled, his breathing steady, and in that heartbeat of silence before the next move, the entire alley seemed to lean inward, as if the walls themselves wanted to see how this would end. Another rushed from the right, knife flashing under the dim light, his steps splashing water in violent bursts, each one closing the gap between them. Leon's eyes locked on the blade, the movement of the wrist, the angle of the shoulders. Everything. Speaking the language of a man who had killed before, the blade came fast low, then high in a feint, meant to draw Leon's guard down. But Leon did not bite his hands. Came up not to block, but to capture, his left hand clamping down on the attackers. Forearm his right slamming into the inside of the elbow, driving the arm outward. The knife wavered for a split second, enough for Leon to twist his grip, forcing the man into the wall, the blade arm pinned tight, the impact jolting through both their bodies. Leon's knee came up hard into the man's midsection, the sound of air being forced from his lungs, cutting short any cry for help. Leon felt the man's strength falter, and in that moment he struck the arm down against the edge of the wall, the blade dropping into the puddle below. Leon bent low, scooping the weapon in the same motion, and drove it upward into the man's ribs. The rain washed over both of them, hiding the blood, but not the shock in the man's eyes. His legs gave way, and he slid to the ground, the knife sliding free with a hiss of steel against fabric. Leon stepped back, already searching for the next threat. One of the remaining men had taken position a few meters away, his pistol aimed dead at Leon's chest. His stance wide, his finger squeezing. But Leon had seen the twitch in his hand before the shot came. He shifted to the left, the bullet slicing past his ribs so close he felt the heat of it, his boots splashing as he closed the distance in 3. Long strides! The man fired again, the shot cracking the air, but Leon's hand was already on the pistol, pushing it aside, the muzzle flash lighting the rain inches from his face. The struggle was brutal, the pistol trapped between their hands, twisting. In the slick rain, Leon drove his forehead into the man's nose, the crunch immediate, the pistol falling away as the man stumbled back, clutching his face. Leon caught the back of his neck, pulling him forward into a sharp knee to the jaw. The man crumpled, collapsing into the water like a dropped sack, his body still twitching from the impact. The last man was circling now, his boots silent on the wet pavement, his eyes narrow and calculating, no weapon in his hands. But his stance told Leon he was no less dangerous. The man moved like a fighter, one who knew exactly when to strike. Leon kept his body loose, his breathing steady, letting the man close the gap. The rain between them, a shimmering curtain, hiding the smallest shifts in weight. The man lunged suddenly low, aiming for Leon's legs, but Leon stepped back just far enough to let the grab miss his hands coming down on the man's shoulders as he passed. Leon used the momentum to spin him around, shoving him toward the wall. The man caught himself and twisted, throwing a wild elbow, but Leon ducked under it, his own fist driving into the side of the man's neck. The impact forcing him off balance. Leon followed with a hook to the temple, the force sending the man sprawling. Sideways, his head striking the wall before he slid down into the water. The alley was silent now except for the rain and Leon's own breathing. His chest rising and falling, his hands still ready, his eyes scanning every shadow to be sure none of them would rise again. 5 enemies in less than a minute, each one down. Each one still, Leon stood over the last body, the rain rolling off his face as if washing the fight away. But inside his mind, the clock was still ticking, because he knew the city did not run out of enemies. 3 remained their steps circling like wolves' eyes locked on him, but Leon's training burned hotter than fear, every part of his body alive, and calculating his mind, mapping every angle, every possible move. The rain kept falling hard, the cold, biting into his skin, but it only sharpened his focus. His boots shifted slightly on the slick ground, the smallest adjustment to balance ready for sudden weight change. The first of the 3 moved in fast, swinging a length of steel pipe. The air, whistling as it cut through where Leon's head had been. A split second before, Leon ducked low, his shoulder driving into the man's stomach. The impact folding him over Leon's arm, hooked around his back, gripping the edge of his belt, lifting. And turning with raw force, the man's feet left the ground before his body slammed into the pavement, the sound of the hit carrying over the storm. Leon wrenched the pipe from limp fingers without breaking stride. The second came from the left, a pistol raised and ready, but Leon hurled the pipe in a short, brutal throw, the heavy metal striking his forearm. The shot went wild, slamming into the wall behind them. Leon was already on him, closing the gap, his hands grabbing the barrel and wrenching. It down his knee, smashed into the man's thigh, the pistol sliding free. Leon caught it in mid-air, spinning it into his palm with practiced ease. The third hesitated just long enough for Leon to fire twice, the sound deafening in the close space, the muzzle flash cutting through the rain, the man's body jolting back before collapsing into the water, his weapon skittering away. Leon turned instantly back to the second, his pistol now leveled between the man's eyes, but Leon did not shoot instead. His left hand lashed out, grabbing the man's jacket, pulling him forward into a sharp headbutt. The crunch of bone loud, even over the rain. The man dropped limp. The first man groaned from the ground, trying to roll away. Leon stepped toward him. Pistol, still in hand, but he knew bullets were not necessary. He crouched beside him, grabbed the front of his shirt, and yanked him upright before slamming him back against the wall. The breath knocked from his lungs. Leon's knee pressed into his ribs, holding him in place while his free hand drove a short, precise punch into his throat. The man gagged, clawing at Leon's arm before his strength gave out. The pistol felt light in Leon's hand. Now the weight of the fight almost gone, the air in. The alley thick with steam from the rain meeting the heat of blood. Leon stood in the center scanning the bodies, each one unmoving. Each weapon scattered the silence, returning in slow, heavy waves, broken only by the water running through the cracks. In the pavement, the clock in his head told him less than a minute had passed from the first move to the last. Leon knew the fight was over, but his stance stayed tight, his eyes never leaving the far end of the alley in case more shadows broke away. From the walls, the rain drummed harder, as if trying to wash away the violence, but it could not touch the memory of the movements burned into his muscles. His breathing slowed, but his pulse stayed high, the hunter's edge refusing to fade even. When the prey was gone, for a moment he let the quiet settle, feeling the rhythm of the rain again, the world around him widening. After the tunnel of the fight, he stepped over the bodies, picking up his rifle from where it lay in a shallow pool, the metal cold in his hands, the familiarity returning like a missing limb. He checked the chamber, the motion smooth and instinctive before slinging it over his shoulder, his eyes still scanning every doorway, every rooftop, every shifting shadow. The alley had given him 5 enemies and taken them back in 52 seconds, but Leon knew there would be more. The city always had more. And as he stepped into the deeper rain beyond the alley, his body was already preparing for the next time the silence broke. 52 seconds after the first move, the alley was still again, the storm falling in heavy sheets that blurred the edges of the bodies on the ground. Leon stood in the center, his boots in shallow water, his chest rising and falling slow but deep, his eyes scanning every shadow, every glint of light, every ripple in the puddles. The silence after the fight was heavier than the fight itself. It pressed in close, filling the air with the weight of what had just happened. The smell of gunpowder hung thick, mixing with the cold scent of wet brick and asphalt, the rain trying to wash it away but unable to. The bodies lay where they had fallen, each one still, their weapons scattered across the slick pavement, some half submerged in the water. Leon's rifle sat steady against his shoulder, his fingers resting loose on the grip, but his mind was still sharp, still counting, still expecting movement. Because in places like this, enemies did not always stay down, and allies were even harder to find. He took a slow step forward, boots splashing the water, spreading out in rings like ripples from the fight itself. His eyes shifted to the far end of the alley, where the narrow gap opened back into the city. The faint hum of street noise carried over the rain, but it felt far away, distant, like another world. He could almost see the glow of traffic lights bleeding into the mist, but he did not step toward them yet. Instead, he crouched beside the man who had taken his rifle. At the start, the weapon had been returned to him, but Leon still looked into the man's face, eyes half open, mouth slack. Rain streaking down his skin, Leon searched for any sign of breath. There was none. He reached down, pulled the spare magazine from the man's vest, and slipped it into his own pocket. Every movement silent, efficient, without waste. He moved to the next body, the hooded man, the knife still in the water beside him, the handle rocking gently with the motion of the rain hitting the puddle. Leon picked it up, turning it in his hand, the weight familiar, the blade sharp. Despite the wet, he tucked it into his belt before moving on. The alley was quiet except for the rain and the soft creak of his gear as he moved. Every step carried him past. Another reminder of how fast everything had happened, how quickly 5 men had appeared, and how quickly they had fallen. He could still feel the heat in his muscles, the echo of the fight in his bones, his breathing slow now, but steady. Every movement Under control, his eyes cutting through the darkness for anything that should not be there. When he reached the end of the alley, he stopped his back to the brick wall, his head tilted slightly to catch every sound beyond the rain. There was nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no more threats for now. His grip tightened on the rifle for a second before loosening again, his mind already replaying the fight. Breaking it down piece by piece, not out of regret, but as a soldier's instinct to prepare for the next one. The city lights flickered faintly through the mist at the mouth of the alley, the glow casting long, thin shadows across the wet pavement. Leon stepped into that light, slow, deliberate, every sense still awake. The fight might be over, but the night was not, and he knew the night never really ended here. It only shifted, waiting for the next moment when silence turned into violence. He reached the sidewalk, the sound of passing cars muffled by the storm, the people out there walking. Under umbrellas or rushing for shelter would never know what had happened just a few meters away. They would never smell the gunpowder or see the blood being thinned by the rain. They would never know about the man who walked out of that alley. With 5 enemies down in 52 seconds, rifle back in his hands, eyes already on the horizon for the next fight. Leon did not slow his pace as he blended into the crowd, the rifle hidden now under the dark folds of his coat, the knife at his belt, the weight of the night still on his shoulders. He knew this was not the end, not for him. Not for the city. There would always be another alley, another shadow, another moment, when the rain turned into something else entirely, and he would be there, ready.